So today we're going to focus on rectangles, rhombuses, and squares, which are all special kinds of parallelograms. So for each one of these, the rules of a parallelogram also apply. So opposite sides are still congruent. Opposite sides are still parallel. Opposite angles are congruent, and consecutive angles are supplementary. So each one of those things is still true, but there's also more to them. So a rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. So that means in a rectangle, every one of its angles are congruent, not just opposite angles. So all angles are congruent with their measure equal to 90 degrees because they're right angles. So diagonals of a rectangle are congruent, which is a new thing. Before, we just knew that they cut each other in half. Now for a rectangle, we know that they're congruent. So for a rhombus, it's a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. So opposite sides are still congruent, but it just means consecutive sides are also congruent. And the diagonals are perpendicular, which means when they intersect each other, they form a right angle. So they form 4 triangles. When you draw both diagonals in, they form 4 right triangles on the inside of the rhombus. So last we have a square. And a square is a parallelogram with 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. So basically, a square is a combination of a rectangle and a rhombus. So because it's a combination of a rectangle and a rhombus, everything that's true for a rectangle and true for a rhombus is true for a square. So these diagonals are congruent, so they have equal length, and they're perpendicular to one another. So when you write the diagonals of a square in, they're going to form 4 right triangles that are also congruent on the inside of the square. So now we're going to do some true or false questions. So a square is a rectangle and a rhombus. Well, if we go back to what a square is, it has 4 right angles, which is true of a rectangle, and it has 4 congruent sides, which is true of a rhombus. Therefore, number 1 is true. So number 2, a rhombus is always a square. If we go back, a rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides, but a square has 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. So number 2 is false. A rectangle is also a square. If we go back and look at what a rectangle is, it's a parallelogram with 4 right angles. But a square also has to have 4 congruent sides. So a rectangle is not also a square. So make sure you come back and watch the next video where we talk about other kinds of parallelograms called a trapezoid.